Hello and welcome back to today's symposium, Reading Shirley Jackson in the 21st Century, The House That Jackson Built. My name is Reid. I teach in the English department at Dawson College in Montreal, and my research focuses on representations of architecture in the Gothic and horror genres. I'm very excited to be moderating our second panel today, which is on the topic of folk horror and Shirley Jackson. I'm also very excited to be joined by Dr. Faye Ringel and Dr. Kevin Corstorphine. Faye is Professor Emerita of Humanities at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. Her most recent book is The Gothic Literature and History of New England, Secrets of the Restless Dead. And her first fiction publication, there it is, her first fiction publication, a short story about the Rhode Island vampire exhumations, was also published this year in the anthology We Are Providence, Tales of Horror from the Ocean State. Kevin is lecturer in American literature at the University of Hull and program director in American Studies. His research interests lie in horror and Gothic fiction, both literary and popular. And he is particularly interested in representations of space, place, the environment, and haunted locations. He has published widely on authors such as Bram Stoker, H.P. Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, and of course, Shirley Jackson. Thank you both for being here. Also, I think Bernice Murphy is going to also join us for today's discussion. I don't know if she had a little chance to rest after that first panel. She's back here doing some double duty. Welcome, Bernice. I don't think you need much introduction.
I'm back wearing a cardigan to change my look.
Perfect, yes. Yeah, costume change. Perfect. I'll just say a few things for the audience. I'm just repeating some of the stuff that I know Janice and Rob has already mentioned. Before we jump into our discussion, I'll just note that in the chat, there should be a link to our Discord server. And on the server, you can find some ongoing discussion about today's event and about Jackson. And you can also find full bios for all of the speakers and panelists. Toward the end of today's panel, just like the last one, there will be time for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for our speakers, just feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Okay. All right, so my first question for all of you really has to do with the term folk horror itself. It's a somewhat recent designation, but one that seems to be consistently evolving and changing, and in particular seems to be enjoying a huge resurgence of interest today. And so maybe just a good place to start would be simply to ask what you each make of this term and how you understand folk horror itself. We can start maybe with Faye.
Thank you. As it happens, if people are really curious about the permutations of the term folk horror, the documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, directed by Shirley Jackson, who happens to be on this call, I believe. She's, I think I saw her name in the participants, is 3 hours devoted to just answering that question. So I don't think we can quite even have enough time to do that. But I'd like to propose a distinction. If the term folk horror, as Luke just mentioned, has had is currently trendy, popular, whatever. It has a long prehistory, and it has been used in the past. But I think that recently it tends to be reserved for what that documentary calls the unholy trinity of late 60s, early 70s British films that all put forward an idea, a certain plot of the clueless outsider encounters an ancient pagan cult or the revival of a pagan cult and becomes the designated sacrifice. And that has had, speaking of revivals, a revival in film recently. But I'll try to remember to use the term folkloric Gothic for all of the other types of horror based on the world folklore of the supernatural, or fairy tales, or local monsters, or all the other folkloric elements that we find in Shirley Jackson and also that really are encompassed by the term folk horror.
Interesting. Okay, I might come back to that just to sort of the distinction you're making between the two. Kevin, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on just the term folk horror and how it's what it means to you and how it's evolving.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Actually, what Faye said there as well, that we could take a very expansive view of this, couldn't we? I was reading about folk horror, and one thing that came up, a book that I've been teaching on my module actually is Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians, and that dealing with Blackfoot stories and spiritual beliefs came up in some of these lists of folk horror. So I thought that was so interesting. I wouldn't have associated that, but that's that wider perspective. Coming from the UK, I tend to think of that the Holy Trinity that Faye is talking about, particularly the Wicker Man, that kind of encapsulates all of those themes. The clueless outsider, which I think we'll get into absolutely with Shirley Jackson's work for sure. But this discovery, a horrific discovery of pagan beliefs, of potential supernatural happenings that is just under the surface. And it certainly comes up all over the place. In fact, Bernice and I, of course, were just at the International Gothic Association conference in the summer, where Bernice's colleague Jarlath Colleen was discussing folk horror in Irish film, at the time the Celtic Tiger, well, actually post-Celtic Tiger. So having kind of contemporary resonances. And I say, yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about film and television, although of course there's a great crop of literature now working in this tradition.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get a little later on to some of the more recent iterations of the genre, and again to see maybe some more distinctions between how it's approached and how it's evolved. But Bernice, did you want to chime in on how you see that term folk horror?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd say that conference Kevin was at was really well organized. I mean, it was just, sorry, joking. We had it here at Trinity. But I have a little bit of a bugbear in that I feel maybe I'm a little bit of a folk horror purist, and I might perhaps be too narrow in my own definition of folk horror. That is entirely possible, in that I think folk horror is absolutely fascinating, but I think as it's become part of almost the general cultural consciousness in a way that's quite remarkable in the last few years, that it's become an incredibly expansive term. I think in ways that sometimes maybe take it a little bit away from what makes folk horror so interesting. So, and maybe this is partially because I wrote a book about the rural Gothic called The Rural Gothic. I think that the Venn diagrams between rural Gothic and folk horror, they certainly overlap and they have a huge amount in common. And quite often a folk horror text will also be a rural Gothic text and vice versa. But they're not necessarily the same thing. And not every spooky happening in a rural community is folk horror. And not every folk horror tale has to be rural necessarily. So for me, one thing that, and I think Faye's kind of touched upon this, my own, admittedly, again, perhaps rather narrow sense of what it is that this sense of some sort of ritual or sort of is our tradition underpinning what is happening, some sort of collective happening. And again, going back to Jackson and the lottery, for me is really key to what makes folk horror so special and so interesting. But again, I know that is perhaps a rather narrow view of what it is. So I hold my hands up on that score.
I mean, that's interesting. And actually, I mean, I'm curious because I think this might touch on what each of you just said. If there are these distinctions, and because place and regions are so important to folk horror, of course, I'm curious to come back to something like Kevin, you mentioned, like you wouldn't have thought certain aspects that you would see in maybe North American folk horror that doesn't really resonate necessarily with your particular understanding of the term. What are the differences between, let's say, like an old world kind of European folk horror and maybe North American? I know also, Bernice, you've written a little bit about this as well, I think, those distinctions. I don't know if, Kevin, you want to start us off with that? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, not to intrude the rural Gothic distinction Bernice can come in on, but the kind of the backwoods, the forgotten places, in terms of the British and Irish Gothic, there's quite a lot of discussion of the Celtic fringes so frequently, texts will take place in kind of Cornwall or Scotland, sometimes even the wilds of Yorkshire, and of course Ireland is an almost kind of fantastical location. And yeah, I think what we see a lot, of course, in North American fiction is well, plenty of Gothic commentators have discussed the wilderness, the woods, the forests. But I'm thinking about kind of the Appalachians, these kinds of forgotten or considered to be forgotten communities, stumbled across by outsiders. So yeah, the other thing, of course, that seems to be resurging is an interest in specifically North American folklore, like cryptids. I see a lot about Bigfoot, things. I actually just got a board game to play with my kids. There's a horror movie board game, Horrified American Monsters, and it's got all of these Bigfoot and the Mothman and the Jersey Devil. And I think there's a real kind of resurgence of interest in specific North American traditions. Of course, thinking about Native American representation, we've seen the Wendigo come up quite a lot, often misrepresented, of course, in horror fiction. But that kind of search for a folk tradition in North American culture.
If I could jump in on
Yeah,
that.
go. Yeah, please do.
Well, I find it very interesting that a genre that depends for its interest on the survival of outmoded customs and beliefs that survive to wreak havoc in the real world is itself perpetuates an exploded, outmoded anthropological theoretical framework that was actually still current when Stanley Edgar Heinemann was writing anthropological school criticism, and that is the doctrine of survivals, which comes out of Tyler in the 1870s and 80s. That is that the traditions and customs of the uncivilized lower stages of human development are retained by primitive people or by, as Kevin was saying, isolated corners of the civilized world, and that by studying them, anthropologists can learn something about what primitive man was really like. Well, just listen to all those assumptions. This word with its unexamined assumptions that everything but our own stage is barbaric. And so this the modern outsider who is suddenly confronted by these survivals in folk horror is assumed to be the superior human suddenly reverting to barbarism. And what's so great about the lottery, as patient zero of folk horror, is that it does not actually have those assumptions, that you don't have the clueless outsider. What you have is the reader taking that role, the reader being forced to examine the reader's own assumptions about their own society by reading that story. And of course, as we know from the letters that came into the New Yorker after the publication, many people took it all too literally and wanted to know where this was happening and where they could go and perhaps watch this. Are these lotteries still being held, and so on. So.
Yeah, that's a wonderful reading of the story, and also through the lens of folk horror and sort of flipping it on its head. You're anticipating, I think, my next question in some sense. Just listening to all you talk about the term folk horror itself, you can hear many echoes and resonances with Jackson's work, but of course, the term as we sort of know it wouldn't have existed at the time that she was writing. So I'm curious what you think Jackson herself, might have made of a term like folk horror, this designation. I don't know if Bernice, you want to start us off with that.
Well, I suppose in as much as one can speculate, I think she probably would have raised her eyebrows at academic nonsense. Possibly.
A little snarl.
Yeah, a little snarl. But I mean, I think if you think of like to sort of piggyback off what Faye was saying about the lottery, if you look at a story like The Summer People, I mean, Jackson knew exactly what she was doing there. It's an incredibly subtle, actually morbidly kind of funny story as well, I think, as well as being quite bleak, where essentially sorry, I was going to use a very Irish phrase and swear if people will bear with me, but I think the piss is being taken out of the Allisons, these kind of, you know, city people who go to the countryside and have all of these really condescending assumptions about, they talk about degenerate Yankees and the bad land and how everyone in the grocery store is a little bit slow, and then have these, you know, assumptions that they are, which are never explicitly confirmed. So it could be happening or it might not be happening in a very typical Jackson fashion. Are they being punished for violating local tradition and staying past Labor Day? I mean, that's something like that's almost like a kind of a New Yorker cartoon, kind of like, but also it's a tremendously good horror story. And I think in a way she's poking fun at exactly the kind of assumptions that Faye has mentioned there about, you know, uncivilized backwoods regions. So I think I'm not sure what she would have maybe felt about the term, but I think she would have absolutely kind of understood what it was, and you know, it's not just in the lottery and the Summer People, but I think even, I don't know if you call it folk horror, I don't, you know, but I think even a novel like We've Always Lived in the Castle, where you have those kind of fascinating use of ritual and tradition and sort of a very claustrophobic kind of community with outsiders within it. You can see these things happening over and over. I mean, even from the road through the wall, which we briefly mentioned in the last panel as well, where you have a ritual outsider selected arguably in the form of, you know, Todd, the boy who becomes kind of the scapegoat for this community, except it's in a suburban setting. So sorry, it's a very convoluted answer, but I think absolutely she perhaps would have recognized elements of her own work in there, whatever she might have made of the term itself in a technical sense. But that's just speculation, you know.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, I think you're touching on a lot of the, like, you know, the fact that Jackson infuses a lot of the boundary policing in her work, the sort of collective against an outsider, with this kind of humor and this ambiguous horror that's there as well. And you can see that sort of playing out in the folk horror genre. I wonder, Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that? What Jackson might have made of this specific term?
Yeah, listen, I'm not. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to speculate on what she might have thought, but I definitely see the resonances here. I was thinking about We've Always Lived in the Castle, and you know, the way that they become something that people whisper about, this kind of sort of legend in the community. It's what I found really interesting actually in the first panel was listening to Pamela talk about what she read and what she's influenced by. I don't want to step on Faye's toes. I've just read her wonderful book on Gothic New England. But what really strikes me is just how much Shirley Jackson was also continuing traditions of stories that people might have been aware of, real life stories, sort of legends, myth. So the idea of folk tradition and those family stories, lots of her work always strikes me as the kind of stories that, you know, an old relative might tell you at a wedding or something like that. That here's something that happened, the kind of family myth, and that sense really comes through in all of her work. So it fits in. She's anticipating it. But yeah, I don't think that the label would have fit so neatly with her conception of her work.
And Faye, I wonder if, since Kevin mentioned your work, if you had some thoughts on that as well.
Well, I've got lots of thoughts where to start, but I will say that what Lawrence said earlier about how she could do everything by implying it rather than stating it. I swear I only noticed on rereading The Lottery for this week for the I don't know how many hundred times, that there's the one sentence that makes it clear that this is not a backwater. That other places hold lotteries. Yeah. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. That one line shows that unlike the sort of folk horror tradition, It's not an isolated backwater or survival, but an integral part of that world. And the reader cannot get off the hook by thinking, oh, well, that's only something that happens in isolated New England, isolated, inbred, puritanical New England. No, it's scapegoating is normal. Sacrifice of the designated victim is normal. And so just wanted to get that in. But certainly in New England, there's a whole line of Vermont Gothic, some of which I dealt with. And yes, there's certainly plenty of New England traditions to draw on for folk horror. But one thing that we haven't mentioned so far that is really integral to folk horror and is part of that unholy trinity, the blood on Satan's claw and witch finder, is witchcraft. And I think that nothing says folk horror like the witch cult. And one could think of Shirley's life and works as a kind of midrash on the figure of woman as witch.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I maybe we can jump to this now, but I had a question about how female characters are represented in folk horror. And again, I know, Bernice, you've written about this as well in terms of the North American folk horror and the feminization of the genre in more recent iterations. So I guess this is sort of a two-part question. One is, how do you see female characters within the folk horror genre? And does that sort of connect with what Jackson might be up to when, in representing women or witches, as they put it? Bernice, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, so this is something I've written about a little bit recently. I think Tessie Hutchinson is really the first in a long line of women who become kind of the center of folk horror. And this is something particularly in recent folk horror, women have very much moved center stage. And I think Jackson, again, is incredibly prescient. I'm not the first to point out, I think it was Fritz Wildschlager, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it, in the 70s, who pointed out that, the name of Tessie Hutchinson has famous New England resonances. I know Faye will obviously be the expert in this, where, famously Anne Hutchinson was expelled from the colony, and I think she was sent to Rhode Island and subsequently got murdered for falling out with the elders on various theological matters. And so you have this association between the female outcast from the community that's embedded arguably in Tessie's name, Hutchinson. I'm thinking of you think of contemporary folk horror. An obvious example here would be Midsommar, which is absolutely fascinating. And I don't know about you guys, but when I saw this film and they actually got to a bit where they had a lottery, I went, oh my God! Surely, because of course I will argue that she invented everything. But I think you have there a fascinating, like folk horror, it very often pivots around the idea of insiders becoming outsiders, or outsiders coming into a very enclosed community and being punished for that. So I think what you have in Midsommar is a really interesting, I guess, a kind of a reversal almost of the lottery, where you have an outsider who comes in and then becomes part of the family through these kind of ritual sacrifices. So there's films like The Other Lamb, which is a really interesting recent folk horror film that actually was partly filmed here in Ireland, which is about a kind of a very patriarchal cult, where a cult leader has sort of various sort of sister wives and daughters, and there's blurred lines between them. And again, it focuses around a teenage girl. Midsommar I've mentioned already. Films like Pyewacket, which is a really fascinating, we're talking about witchcraft, as Faye mentioned, really interesting modern day folk horror witchcraft tale about a disenchanted teenage girl. So I think there's quite a few other examples I could mention as well. But I think women have moved, for whatever reason, to the center of contemporary cinematic folk horror in quite an interesting way. And I do think in part that's something that Jackson, I think sort of anticipated in a fascinating way in The Lottery. As to how direct that connection is, I'm not really sure. But I think, again, it's maybe part of a way in which Jackson sort of anticipated the world in which we find ourselves, perhaps. I don't know what Faye and Kevin reckon about that. My speculative musings.
If I could jump in about Anne Hutchinson, she was expelled from Massachusetts. She ended up in Rhode Island, where with Roger Williams, they were both dissenters, but then she fell out even with the other dissenters in Rhode Island. She wasn't expelled, but she and her family, were no longer welcome, and they took off for New York. And on the way, they were following the coastal path, and she was there was a Native American attack in what's now New Rochelle, New York, and she and her family were murdered. And there's now a road called the Hutchinson River Parkway that is named after her. It goes back past that site, in fact. But what makes her such a perfect choice, and I know that Shirley would have known that because she had read Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi, and she had a copy. Of course, Mather devotes chapter after chapter to the horrors and terrors of Anne Hutchinson and how good it was that she was duly punished. But he tells a story of her having given birth to a horrifying monster with really creepy, lots of description. So I'm sure that Shirley knew that story as well. But as far as I'm so glad, Bernice, that you made the distinction between, say, the modern iteration of folk horror film. In the original folk horror films, really, women, and particularly young females, were only useful as virgin sacrifice or plot device to lure the outsider. And even Lovecraft, the adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, which was not at all, whose character was not at all like that, was played by Sandra Dee, who they shoehorn in that late 60s adaptation into that beautiful young girl who lures the outsider character. So
yeah, I think it would be fascinating to compare the treatment of women in contemporary folk horror to, and even what Kevin mentioned, and you mentioned the English Holy Trinity of folk horror films, because you're absolutely right, it's so different.
I wonder, Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that? The sort of gendered
Yeah, that's a good way into what I was thinking about, which is this kind of role of young women in particular, and a certain kind of potential innocence, which I think is a lot more complex in Jackson. But I was looking at, we were talking about the publication history. Some of the older versions of The Haunting of Hill House have this Gothic romance kind of cover to them. And I was just thinking about how Jackson riffs on that kind of classic Anne Radcliffe Gothic, Austen's Northanger Abbey, this kind of story about a young woman who is often kind of naive to the world and learns about the world through encountering these horrors. Now, Eleanor, of course, is a great example of that, but there's so much going on. The secrets come out of her own past as she encounters this world. But there's been a recent fascination with this, and there was a discussion earlier about the current popularity of Jackson. I was thinking about how this especially The Haunting of Hill House, there's that strange synchronicity that comes out just before Plath's The Bell Jar, which is another story about a young woman going out into the world and a kind of an interruption of that narrative. And I was thinking about the recent popularity of Mad Men with Elizabeth Moss's character, Peggy, in that, and of course, interesting that she goes on to play Shirley in the film of the same name. But there's a kind of fascination with that kind of particular narrative of young women, particularly going to the big city on her own, entering into a career, and quite a lot of the short stories are in that vein as well. So yeah, I'd just be interested to kind of wonder what the other panelists think of that, what she does with that archetype.
Yeah, again, I think you're actually anticipating one of the questions here, just in terms of two things really. Folk horror is clearly experiencing some sort of resurgence in interest, or renewed interest in it, and this is obviously something that's happening for the past decade with Jackson as well. And I kind of suspect when we ask that question, why has maybe Jackson been ignored in earlier decades? We're starting to answer it right here with sort of depictions of what Barry was put as women's psychology, the ambiguity of representations of women. So all this to say, I wonder, is there a kind of connection here between the renewed interest in folk horror and maybe this shift that some of you are alluding to, with a more focus on female-centric narratives, and maybe also a renewed interest in Jackson's work, and if anyone wanted to speak to that.
Well, if I could come back to the fascination with cults, certainly. I mean, that I really don't know if if you can see a direct influence between Jackson's work and the current makers of folk horror, except maybe The Lottery. However, I can say that The Other Lamb, I want to give a shout out to my dear young friend Catherine Smythe McMullen, who was the script writer on that, and that the original short story she wrote on which script was based, she and I talked about Shirley Jackson. So I can certainly attest that there was influence there.
That's
Now,
brilliant. I didn't know that.
But I think that Luke is on to something, that maybe both are responding to our times rather than one causing the other, and that the power of cults, that cults are both seductive and fearful, that expresses an anxiety. In the late 60s and 70s, it was a clear one-to-one. Those folk horror films were, you look at them now, there's one that was filmed in Vermont called Transformations, that was all about a witch cult in Vermont in 1970. They definitely, you look at them and they look like they could be footage from actual cults of the time or actual communes, as that one was. And so there was this great anxiety about our young people being lured away by these cults, and they'll all turn into the Manson family or whatever. And today, I think it's a little more, sort of diffuse. There's not a one-to-one relationship between Midsummer and a fear of a particular cult in Sweden or something, but rather this seductive power of fundamentalist ideas that is so visible in the world, and that can be so scary. And again, that's something that once again Jackson seems to have predicted.
Well, I wonder too, Faye, I know you're interested in apocalyptic folk horror, and I wonder if talking about cults, if that relates in any way. I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit about that particular subgenre of folk horror, and how it might relate to some of the things that you're pointing out right now.
Yes. What I'm interested in, the way that today's apocalyptic fantasy thrillers, whether in the form of film or a huge mass of professional and amateur, it's essentially a fan fiction about post-apocalyptic. There's going to be a few survivors, and they'll have to struggle, and they'll revert to barbarism, and all of the tropes that we saw of that original folk horror definition of the barbarism and devolution and cults, of course, would be transposed to this future. And really, in the Sundial, which we had a wonderful discussion about the Sundial in that way, you can see it that the people inside, you've got the primal scene of the people in their fortified bunker, prepped for the end, the doomsday preppers, and then you have all of those other survivors outside staring in, wanting to, threatening, wanting to come in and get what's theirs. And this is something that we see in post-apocalyptic horror, whether it's on the literary side of the spectrum of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, all the way to these exploitation films and novels that really just use this as an excuse to put forward totalitarian tropes of everyone's got to be armed because the government is going, we'll be the survivors after the government falls, or so.
Definitely, there certainly seems to be a resurgence of apocalyptic narrative in general, and as you're pointing out, specifically apocalyptic folk horror comes into play there as well. I don't know, Kevin, did you want to talk about that, about this connection between folk horror and apocalypticism?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just thinking about how there's I don't know about statistics on this, but there seems to be a rise in homeschooling and kind of people being taken out of the mainstream. And certainly we're all aware that there is a rise of, or certainly spread by social media of conspiracy theory and so on. But it definitely, awareness of this stuff speaks to our moment, I think, thinking about that, the isolation of the sundial with recent decades, with the revelations of for instance, large-scale abuse in institutions, like boarding schools, religious institutions, and so on, and what can happen in those very isolated communities. If you go on things like, Netflix, there are endless documentaries about people escaping fundamentalist families and kind of cults. So it's that kind of a fascination with that as well as having a cultural moment, I think, which is partly ties into what Faye was talking about.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but if I could come back to the sundial and the other, you might say the other aspect of woman is witch is woman as prophet. And we have in the sundial Aunt Fanny, who is on the one hand the prophetic voice. She echoes the Old Testament prophets like Obadiah with her predicting a great burning and the Father will protect. And at the same time, she's constantly undercut by humor, and we're not permitted to see her as a frightening figure. Instead, we see her as someone who is disdained by Mrs. Haller and the others, and yet she turns completely practical, and she becomes the doomsday prepper. She even orders things from mail order houses. You could just imagine, Amazon sending all these all of this, and that's. She really does feel extremely prescient in that.
It's interesting too that in the sundial, I mean, maybe the figure of horror to a certain extent is Oriana, is Mrs. Halloran instead, and then maybe Fancy, who assumes a very different role from a prophet or a prophetess, sort of just usurping the power of the former Mr. Halloran. A lot of what we're talking about is place and space, region, outsiders, insiders. And this is sort of alluded to by Bernice earlier when you mentioned the road through the wall. I'm wondering if people could talk a little bit about the relationship between rural and urban, but also suburban spaces, both in Jackson's work as well as in folk horror, particularly when it comes to themes like a trespass, or intrusion. I don't know if that's of interest to anyone. Yeah, go for it.
I'm very into suburbs, so
me too.
I get excited when they're exactly. You would be very into them yourself. I think Jackson's really, again, it's another example of the way where Shirley Jackson invented everything. But I think she's one of the first major American writers to kind of recognize that the liminality of suburbia is something that can breed unease and is a perfect incubator for the Gothic. And whereas one might necessarily characterize a novel like The Road Through the Wall as quite being perhaps as classically Gothic as, say, something like We've Always Lived in the Castle or Hill House, I think you can see a lot of the same preoccupations there. I think it's one of the reasons why it's a shame that even to this day, I think The Road Through the Wall hasn't quite gotten the attention that it deserves and is still quite critically neglected, bizarrely, is because you can see so much of themes that Jackson will later develop in other works more famously. I mean, it came out, it was written at a very similar time period, famously, of course, to The Lottery. And again, I'm not the first critic to point out, there were people in the 70s and very good articles pointing this out, that there's huge overlap between The Lottery and her suburban story, The Road Through the Wall. So I think in particular, she picked up on the liminality, in the sense that a suburb is kind of neither one thing or another. And the I guess you could call it the uncanny and ambiguous kind of resonances of that kind of and also I think she's also very good on class, which I don't think is something that's talked about nearly enough in relation to Jackson even to this day. And that's a novel where the relationship between class and space is really important. I just, if you haven't read The Road Through the Wall, do. It's tremendous. So sorry, thus ends my public service announcement.
No, I mean, as you mentioned a little bit earlier too. I mean, there's some. I mean, I wouldn't describe The Road Through the Wall as a folk horror novel, but I think you're right to point out that someone like Todd is this sort of scapegoated figure, or even Carolyn is this kind of indirect sacrifice amidst the community. And you sort of see these, I don't know, like a modern kind of iteration of what you would see maybe in a more traditional folk horror.
And I think too, you could argue that the Road Through the Wall is also a tremendous California Gothic text. And it's Joan Wiley Hall points out in her really excellent article from about 20 years ago on The Road Through the Wall, still one of the best things ever written about that novel, where she points out that it's a novel that has a character that shares a name with Todd Hackett in The Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West. And Stanley, of course, wrote a monograph on Nathaniel West. And so you have all these fascinating, sorry, that's another type of Gothic, not necessarily folk horror, but there's kind of so much in there.
Sorry, Faye, did you want to say something?
Bernice's book on the rural Gothic is really, I mean, the whole thing could apply here. But just thinking of the story we haven't mentioned, The Renegade. I think The Renegade is a perfect example of that city folk versus country folk dynamic. Then ne'er the twain shall meet. They were still city folk and would probably always be city folk. People who owned a chicken-killing dog. People who were not able to fend for themselves against the limited world of earth and food and weather that the country folk took so much for granted. Yeah, I mean, it really, that just says it all, and the horror that underlies that, and the end that we'll never forget, where she feels the spikes of the dog's collar against her throat.
Wow. Kevin, did you want to talk about place, space, in relation to folk horror and maybe Jackson as well?
Yeah, it's just probably perhaps less folk horror, but kind of coming back to the discussions we've already had of Jackson as an incredibly subtle writer, and a writer that alludes to things and creates mood more than anything. And quite a lot of the short stories, particularly set in New York around apartment living, I think speak to that. Think of something like The Villager, where the protagonist kind of sees herself as this very bohemian kind of character and almost creates a life for herself. And as she's sort of pretending to be the person renting out, I believe, an apartment. And there's another story. I was desperately flicking through a book to try to remember the name of it. Someone will remind me of what it's called. But there's this story where a young woman, her neighbor, is coming into her house and taking away bits and pieces of her belongings. She's taking away kind of a piece of clothing or some.
Is that The Little House?
Oh, The Little House. I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
And in that story, she simply discovers that these things are being taken, finds out that they are, and then simply doesn't raise the issue. It's so wonderfully subtle, and a kind of and brings to mind those interactions in urban spaces. And a story like that also, what I was thinking about, and this is nothing to do with folk horror, but how ahead of her time she was in terms of writing. I'm thinking about something like Raymond Carver's story, The Neighbours, where the character goes in, he kind of puts on his neighbour's clothes, and kind of that's kind of all there is to it. It's so minimalist, and Jackson's doing that in a lot of her short stories as well, which also brings to mind, to me, kind of anxieties about who's next door to you. Rosemary's Baby is one text that I think bears great comparison to Shirley Jackson's stories of urban living, paranoia, and how much we know other people, and kind of doubt our own identity as well, which is a frequent theme in the short stories in particular, and of course the Haunting of Hill House.
Sorry, Dara chimed in to say the Jackson story title was Trial by Combat, or is it? Yeah.
Yeah, I was flipping through the lottery and other stories. I was like, I know that story you're talking about, but yeah, this idea of trespass, even permitting trespass in some ways, to sort of learn about yourself or learn about outsiders at the same time. Bernice, it looked like you were about to say something. I don't know if you wanted to chime in. Or...
Oh, was this story about outsiders or insiders?
Oh no, yeah, just about like this idea of like trespass or intrusion, or maybe I misread your face.
Oh yeah, sorry. I have the opposite of a poker face. I apologize. Yeah, I think it is such a big facet of her work, isn't it? People violating boundaries, be they often unspoken boundaries and not quite, like Faye mentioned, the renegade, which is such a wonderful example of that, where you have essentially, I guess, a clash between as well these brutally pragmatic and utilitarian country folk and a city person who just doesn't understand and maybe can't quite ever understand or will be able to have quite the same view of the world that they do. So I think she's particularly attuned to those kinds of nuances of a community, and the fact that you might live, I think anyone who's ever lived in a rural community anywhere will maybe be aware of this. You can live somewhere for 20 years but still never quite truly belong or be one of us. And I think Jackson is very good at articulating that in her work. Like even the Blackwoods in Castle, I think it's interesting. Their money insulates them, I think, makes them different from the community. Their money and arguably their arrogance. And of course, the mass murder doesn't help.
But I thought you were going to make that is the perfect example of the class system within a town. That you may have you have this town in America that supposedly is class free, and yet you have such a clearly delineated caste system, whether it's in Sundial or Castle, where there are insiders and insiders. And I was thinking of The Possibility of Evil, that amazing posthumously published last completed story, the idyllic small town with the wonderfully named Miss Adela Strangeworth, who has the obligation of keeping the town clean, and so she has to write all these poison pen letters and punish the sinners. But the world was so large, and there was only one Strangeworth left in it. She's the last of her caste, of her the dominant caste. And
we'll have to. Oh, sorry.
Saying that's folk horror if there ever was any.
I'm always slightly fascinated too by in Hill House, the Dudleys and Mrs. Dudley, and a sense that Mrs. Dudley, as a local and someone who's really part of the community of Hillsdale, she understands that house in a way, and she has this really healthy respect for the house, I think, in a way that these very naive outsiders don't. And that's why, I mean, she's been working in that house with Mr. Dudley, presumably for decades, and they're still alive because they know you don't stay there after dark. They've got this local knowledge, in a sense.
We'll have to shift to the Q&A in a few minutes, but just maybe one last question for all of you. If some of our audience members are maybe coming to folk horror, potentially even through Jackson, I'm wondering, are there particular texts of Jackson's beyond the lottery that you would maybe associate with folk horror would be an interesting way to get into the genre? I know we've talked about a few already, but if there are some that you particularly admire and wanted to mention for our audience, I think that'd be a nice way to wrap up before the Q&A.
Can I mention a non-Shirley Jackson text? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
There's a really wonderful book that from, I think, 1985 that's been reprinted by Valancourt Books, which I'm sure some of our readers will be aware of. incredible work in publishing novels that have fallen out of print, and it's called Childgrave, and it's by Ken Greenhall. And it's a really, really, really tremendous New England Gothic folk horror tale. Very much, I think, building on the tradition, partially established by Jackson, but also doing its own thing. And it's called Childgrave. The village in it is called Childgrave, which is perhaps a tad ominous. And I just really recommend it. It's it's well worth it. It's only about $12, and it's a brilliant little novel that not many people unfortunately have read. So I would recommend that one because it's very Jackson adjacent, and I'd be shocked if Greenhall wasn't quite consciously in a way writing back to Jackson in a way that more famously people like Thomas Tryon did in the Harvest Home.
Yeah. I think we really have mentioned so many of Jackson's works that can be looked at through this lens. Another one is Hangs a Man. And Hangs a Man is itself, I didn't get a chance to do my whole riff on folk music as folk horror, because Shirley Jackson and her daughter Sadie, who we didn't have on this call, were immersed in folk ballads. And the great legacy of the Scots British border ballads and all of those murder ballads and all of those versions of James Harris or The Demon Lover and so on. And those really are form a kind of backdrop from in Hangs a Man. You've got you have quotations from some of them, and you've got this thing that looks completely non-supernatural, and yet there's the there's the folk music, there's the fairy tale folklore of that what can happen in the woods near some trees where Natalie had once encountered knights in armor, and there she's assaulted. And then at college, you have the again going out from the suburban into the woods, and what happens there. So I would say it's interesting to read this novel, which has, of course, been compared to The Bell Jar as well. You mentioned The Bell Jar. Read it through the lens of folk horror.
I'm very happy you mentioned any mention of Hangs a Man. I think is welcome, and still a text that seems to be underread and underwritten about. Kevin, were there texts either of Jackson's or more broadly, entry points for folk horror that you wanted to mention to the audience?
I was just thinking about how all of this comes through so subtly in the novels, and it's there if you look for it, isn't it? Whether it's the poison of We've Always Lived in the Castle, or the Shower of Stones and The Haunting of Hill House, or the kind of the prophecies and the words. I like how she writes in capitals, doesn't she, at the sundial, "What is this world?" And of course, "Help Eleanor come home." There's something so of the folk tradition, of kind of even kind of the medieval about it, and I just love. I'd be fascinated to it is fascinating to trace those influences exactly. I mean, the short story I fixated on has already been discussed here, which is the Summer People, and the title of it even sounds like a ballad, doesn't it, or something like The White People by Arthur Machen, and it's yet it's a very modern story, and it's about the contemporary world, but absolutely fits into that the folk horror template proper, if you will. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on the matter.
That's great. Well, thank you all for being here. I have a few questions in the Q&A that we can get to. The first question is from Abby Monahan, and I suspect this will be of a lot of interest to each of you. She writes, "I'm particularly interested in the eco-Gothic and in Jackson's work. Can I ask about the intersection between folk horror traditions and the landscape, rural or otherwise, that they reside in or stem from?"
If I could I'll start with the Puritans, the prototype people who had a fear of the wilderness. They had an ecophobia, and were the Puritans, who really believed when they came to New England that they were intruding into Satan's kingdom, because this was the land, or as was said about Newfoundland, the land that the Lord gave to Cain. This was out of civilization, and that the only way to civilize it would be to cut down all the trees and also to either extirpate or exile the people living there who were also viewed as part of the landscape and demonic at the same time. And so that great ecophobia really lies at literally at the root of New England Gothic, and Jackson certainly absorbed that both through her studies and through living in Vermont.
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm not, and I'm just mulling this question over. I'm just wondering how much it's changed. I don't want to condemn contemporary folk horror, but this ecophobia, I think, probably persists, where a lot of the horror is often rooted in folk traditions that are closer to nature, sort of Green Man-esque figures, or creatures of nature. Black Phillip of the Witch being a particular standout moment. It's amazing how much contemporary film and fiction, I think, replicates exactly what Faye was talking about with this Puritan association of the woods and nature, and of course Native Americans as well. Thinking of Hawthorne with Goodman Brown and the devilish Indian behind every tree. That this kind of wrapped up idea of native peoples, nature, the devil. It's amazing how it can still be used or implied to kind of work for a modern audience, and problematic as well, I think.
Yeah, and one thing I would mention is that I've done a little bit of work in the past on sort of like the birds upwards, 1960s, 1970s, kind of like almost like first generation filmic eco horror. And I did like a little sort of taxonomy of characteristics that these films tended to have. And I've never actually thought about this, and I probably should have, but actually I think there is some overlap in terms of even plot tropes that you tend to get a lot, in that an awful lot of these films are set in small enclosed rural communities. So you've got Jaws, Squirm, classic, worms, evil worms film, things like that. John Frankenheimer's Prophecy, they're set in small isolated rural communities. The Birds is a classic example of this, where you get an outsider who comes in and sort of disrupts the community, and there's almost a sense that they've kind of triggered it off. And so I think there are various other ways in which, particularly that kind of first wave of classic 70s eco horror, actually, apart from the general ecophobia theme, which Kevin and Faye have both spoken about very articulately, that they kind of overlap in some really interesting and suggestive ways.
I think we have enough time just for one more question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Is there any relation between the haunted house and folk horror? Is there a connection there I know.
I'm so glad you asked. I mean, ghosts kind of get left out of the folk horror definition. I mean, what about ghosts? Are they not folkloric? Are they not found in every culture on Earth? Are they not horrific? Hey, it's their time of year, right? This is we're coming into really peak ghost season at Christmas. But I think that there is a relationship that in that way, The Haunting of Hill House is a foundational text, because look, you have several clueless outsiders who have come to find the reality behind the legends, and they are essentially tormented or punished in some way. And you could argue that Eleanor becomes a kind of sacrifice figure in that way. And then you have the wife, who is the parody of the spiritualist vision, which is the opposite of horror, the friendly ghost paradigm that everything's all wonderful on the other side in the Summerland. And so that, I mean, I think that ghosts should be seen, and ghost lore should be seen as in this way. And the idea of ghosts wreaking revenge and representing those who have to be avenged is another way that ghost lore figures in.
We're pretty much out of time, but I wonder, Kevin, if you had some thoughts on that as well, the connections potentially between folk horror and the haunted house.
Oh yeah, just to jump on it, I mean, the haunting of Hill House, to jump on Faye's point, absolutely stands out, and that great comedic riffing on, have you done anything with planchette, or I suppose you're not mediums, but also stuff like, the Fox Sisters and Hydesville, all that American spiritualist tradition, as being there as a kind of a folkloric thread, a kind of a stream into that as well. Absolutely stands out. And if some of this has come back today, thinking about things like the Conjuring movies and how they play with those sort of dabbling in spiritualism and it going wrong, absolutely kind of a type of modern folklore, and specifically US centric there as well, apart from the Enfield haunting.
Well, I'm sorry to any audience members who we weren't able to get to your questions. A big thank you to Faye and Bernice and Kevin for being here. Thank you so much. We're going to take a short break, and then we're back at 7 o'clock for our final panel of the day, which is on the fictional impact of Jackson's work. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you in a little bit. Thanks again.